Winter in the Kingdom of the North never came quietly. It did not knock on windows, did not settle on rooftops as soft snow, and did not decorate the city with white silence. It burst in like an enemy who had long been holding an axe behind his back. First the glass grew cold, then the buckets by the wells cracked. Then in the mornings, people began to be found in houses who simply had not woken up, and every year the same thing repeated. The authorities said it was a harsh but ordinary winter, while people silently burned everything that could burn. Door frames, old chairs, bookshelves, sometimes other people's hopes. Luan, the blacksmith's apprentice, knew this winter better than his own reflection. He was 17 and he already looked older, hands covered in burns, shoulders slightly crooked, a cautious gaze as if he was always waiting for a blow. He grew up in the lower quarter of the capital, where winter was not a season but an annual sentence. His master, the old blacksmith Weir, liked to repeat, "Iron does not lie. If it is red, it means it is still alive. If it is black, it means it has burned out." Luan listened and nodded, but thought about something else. About how many people simply burn out every winter. This year the cold was especially cruel. It came early, even before the autumn taxes were collected, and struck at once at the villages, the warehouses, the poor quarters. In the homes of the rich, stone hearths burned. Among the nobility, magical braziers. For everyone else, fingers cracked, joints broke, and a cough began that after a week turned into silence. The blacksmith's apprentice quickly learned the price of cold. Not in words, but on his skin. In the very first week, Luan burned his palms when he pulled a blank for a noble order out of the furnace. In the second, he cut his wrist because his fingers obeyed poorly from the frost. In the third, he and his master went into the forest for cheap charcoal, and there they were attacked by hungry wolves. The master fought them off by a miracle. Luan did not by a miracle. He remembered only the crunch of snow under his feet, the smell of iron, his own breath instantly turning into steam, and the wolf that leaped onto his left arm. Its fangs went across his forearm as if across a soft leather strap. Luan managed to shove a torch under its jaws. The flame flared up, the beast jumped back, but not before leaving a deep torn stripe on his arm. The scar remained for life. Back then he did not yet know that losing the use of his hand was not the worst thing about that winter. The worst thing happened 2 weeks later. The village of his childhood died out in one night. Not all of it, but almost. 3 neighbor children with whom he had once run through the ravines did not live to see dawn. Old Rima, who sold hot stew by the bridge, was sitting on a bench in the morning as if she had simply fallen asleep, and only later did everyone see the blue on her lips. Even the blacksmith's helper Kais, a cheerful strong man with an eternal smile, fell ill with a fever and never got up again. Luan stood on the snow watching as they were carried away on the common cart and felt not tears but emptiness. Then he noticed that he could not fully clench his left hand. His fingers obeyed poorly, as if the cold had crawled into his bones and stayed there forever. And it was then that something inside him cracked. Not rage, not bitterness, determination. Not the kind boys have after the first blow of fate. Not showy, not loud. Quiet, heavy, stubborn, like an anvil. He understood that if winter killed people every year, then one had to not accept it, but fight it. And if no one was doing it, then he would have to do it. Blacksmith Weir's workshop stood at the edge of the craftsman's row. A low stone building, blackened with soot, with one narrow window and the eternal smell of coal, oil, and red-hot metal. It was always noisy here. The strike of a hammer, the hiss of water, the creak of bellows. In winter, the workshop became salvation for the neighbors. Unofficial, of course. Weir did not like authority, did not like taxes, did not like the heat collectors who came to check how much firewood someone had received according to the norm, and how much surplus they were obliged to give for the needs of the palace. But he loved people, and therefore often turned a blind eye to the fact that in the evening, 3 frozen children sat in the corner of the workshop, warming their palms over a warm slag bowl. Luan was his best apprentice. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but the most attentive. He noticed how metal changed color at different temperatures, how steel sang when tension appeared inside it, how a crack first became a barely visible white line and then broke an entire blade. Weir said, "A good blacksmith does not just strike with a hammer. He hears where the metal wants to break." Luan heard. And so when one night a city scribe entered the workshop with a royal paper about a new tax collection, Luan was already ready for the worst. The scribe was smooth as a herring and smelled of expensive oils. He did not even take off his fur coat, only looked with disgust at the soot on the walls and said, "The kingdom announces an additional levy for winter maintenance. All craft guilds are required to transfer silver, coal, and 13 sets of metal furnace grates." Weir did not even lift his head from the blank. 13? Have you completely lost your minds there? This is an order of the Council of Heat, the scribe said dryly. Failure to comply is equated with sabotage. Luan, standing by the bellows, slowly wiped his palms on his apron. "Forgive me, Master Scribe," he said quietly. "And who are these grates going to?" The scribe grimaced. "To the outer estates, and to the castle houses, where important people are." It was then that Luan first felt not just anger rising inside him, but the desire to break someone's confident smile. Weir threw him a short warning glance, but not an angry one. The scribe continued, "Your workshop must deliver everything in 3 days. Refusal is unacceptable." "Unacceptable," Weir repeated, and finally raised his head. "Then tell the council that I also consider some things unacceptable. For example, when children die from the cold while palaces roast meat in 3 fireplaces at once." The scribe turned pale. Luan had time to think that now there would be a blow or an arrest. But the scribe only angrily stamped the parchment with his seal and left, promising an inspection. When the door closed, the workshop became quiet. Weir was silent for a long time and then said, "They do not simply want heat, they want everyone to depend on them in winter." Luan slowly nodded, and for the first time he said aloud what had long been spinning in his head. "Then we need to make it so that everyone has heat." Weir looked at him with a somewhat tired smile. "Your hands are young, and your thoughts are dangerous." "The most dangerous mixture. I am serious." "So am I," Weir answered. "But between serious and possible lies an abyss. In winter, people burn not what is convenient, but what they have. A fireplace is just fire in a room. A stove is already better. But to heat an entire house, and even more so a quarter, a different principle is needed." Luan did not look away. "Then we will find it." The idea did not come in the form of illumination. It came the way real discoveries come, after fatigue, anger, and 100 small observations. That winter, Luan often worked near the copper cauldron where the master heated rivets and warmed metal before forging. One day, when the cauldron was covered with a tight lid and a short iron pipe for releasing pressure was accidentally placed on top of it, Luan noticed. The air around this pipe became noticeably warmer, not strongly, but steadily. He stood beside it for a long time, watching the trembling heat move through the metal. Then he put his palm closer and felt the heat did not strike the face like fire. It came evenly, softly, as if it was finding its own way out and spreading through the air. Luan frowned. "Luan, if a closed boiling vat forces steam to move through a pipe, and the pipe heats up along its entire length, then can this be used not for pressure but for heat?" He began to think, draw in coal dust, sketch with a stick on the floor. If one did not make one open brazier, but a closed boiler with water? If it were placed over a constant fire? If a pipe were led from the top, which would not release all the steam at once, but carry it farther along a long closed loop? If this pipe passed through a room or under the floor, heat would begin to spread not from one point, but along the entire line. Not a fireplace, not a stove. A system. "Water boils," he muttered. "Steam goes. The pipe heats. And if the pipe is longer, if it passes through a wall?" He froze. Weir, standing by the anvil, raised an eyebrow. "What are you muttering there, boy?" Luan turned around. His eyes were burning in a way they had not burned for a long time. "Master, what if we do not try to heat the air from one point? What if we make hot steam move through a closed pipe and give off heat along the way?" Weir put down the hammer. "Are you talking about a boiler now?" "About a boiler, but not for cooking. For heating." The old blacksmith snorted. "For heating, we have a fireplace. A fireplace heats only what is near it. But a pipe can go through the house, along the walls, under the floor, through rooms." "A steam pipe?" Weir thought. "Pressure, condensate, leaks. If you make a mistake, it will explode so hard that only traces on the snow will remain." Luan did not retreat. "Then it must be made safe. With a valve, with an emergency outlet, with an expansion chamber, and with thick walls." Weir looked at him intently. Did you come up with all this yourself? Luan hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. And it was an honest nod, although in truth, it was only half honest. He did not know the terms, did not know the calculations, but he knew the principle. And that was enough to begin. Weir tapped a finger on the stand. Then we will do it wisely. If this thing explodes, not even a necromancer will resurrect me afterward. Luan smiled for the first time in a long while. They worked secretly, not because they wanted to hide something, but because any failure in their work could cost too much. The royal inspectors were already looking for illegal heating constructions. The phrase itself sounded ridiculous, but in practice it meant, if someone among ordinary people came up with a way to warm themselves without the palace would have less power. First, Luan made a small copper tank, hermetically riveted on top, a brazier below, a thick pipe above which he led into the next room through the workshop wall. The idea was simple. The steam had to rise, pass through the pipe, give off heat, and return back as condensate. He was proud of himself exactly until the first launch. After 5 minutes, the steam went too fast. After 7, the tank lid warped. After 9, a hot jet burst from the joint, burned the skin on Weir's wrist, and knocked a copper fitting out of the pipe. The master jumped back with curses. Luan rushed to the furnace, nearly overturning the brazier, and only by a miracle did not get boiling water straight in the face. When it was over, the workshop was filled with white fog, and a charred rag smoked in the corner. "Magnificent," Weir said, fanning his face with his palm. "You have invented a way to kill us with boiling water cheaper than a hired assassin." Luan, whose hand ached again in the old scar, only answered gloomily, "That means I made the outlet too narrow, and the pressure reserve too small, and the flaring bad. And perhaps the tank should not have been made hastily from old copper," Weir finished. Luan was not offended. He understood all this himself. The mistake was not in the idea, but in the execution. He remembered this difference for the rest of his life. Then there were more attempts. A pipe too thin cooled too early. A pipe too short heated only one room. A tank too small made the water boil away in an hour. A fire too strong made the steam hit the valve and the whole system trembled. A fire too weak gave almost no heat. They ruined 3 tanks, flooded the workshop twice, once nearly started a fire at the neighbors, and once argued so loudly that the old woman from the house opposite came with a ladle to find out whether they had decided to slaughter a pig right inside the workshop. But Luan did not give up. He was stubborn beyond his years, and more importantly, he knew how to admit where he had been wrong. At night, when the master went to sleep, Luan sat by weak coals and made notes on scraps of paper. Where condensate accumulated, where the pipe made noise, where the wall overheated, where a copper heat exchanger was needed, where it was better to place an air pocket to eliminate shock jolts. At some point, he understood one more thing. If making a closed loop, it was not necessary to drive all the steam around in a circle. A closed vat, a heat source, and a pipe that passes through the room and then returns the condensate back are enough. A simple but brilliant thought. An ordinary room, heated not by flame but by the movement of heat through metal. This is how not a bonfire is born, but a system. The first person who agreed to test their invention was not a king and not a merchant. It was the widow of a tailor named Ilsa. She lived on 5th Street in a small stone house with 2 children and an old mother. In winter, her windows always froze through, and last night her youngest son began coughing blood. Ilsa came to the workshop herself, thin, strict, with a face on which fatigue had long ago become a familiar feature. "Master Weir," she said, "I was told you know how to repair everything that gives heat." Weir only looked at Luan. Luan understood without words. This was their chance. Ilsa's house had 1 living room, a kitchen, and a cold pantry. Luan decided to begin with the living room. They brought a small boiler, a copper pipe, and rough fastenings. They placed the tank near the outer wall, where it was easier to service, and ran the pipe along the floor and partly along the wall so that the heat would spread evenly. Luan worked silently, focused, with a seriousness unusual for his age. Ilsa's children, 2 girls and a sickly boy, watched him with huge eyes. To them, he was not an inventor, but something like a sorcerer who promised to bring heat without fire in the middle of the room. When everything was ready, Luan lit the stove. At first, nothing happened. Then the water in the tank began to crackle. Then a barely audible hum went through the pipe. And finally, the very feeling of the air in the room began to change. Not sharply, not like from a torch. Smoothly. Ilse, standing by the wall, suddenly raised her head. "It is getting warmer," she whispered. Luan looked at the pipe, feeling his heart beat faster. The heat really moved through the room, spreading not as a spot, but as a strip first along the wall, then along the floor, then toward the corner where the children sat. The pantry remained cold, but the living space became noticeably softer. The younger boy, who an hour earlier had been trembling in a blanket, cautiously crawled out, pressed his palm to the pipe, and laughed in surprise. "It does not bite." Luan involuntarily smiled. Ilse slowly sank onto the bench. "Is this safe?" The question was more important than it seemed. Luan shook his head. "Not yet, but we will make it safe." The widow looked at him for a long time. "I do not know how much this costs. I have almost nothing. I will do the first installation for the materials." "Without payment," Luan said. "But if it saves you this winter, then later you will help me with another one." "Another one?" He nodded. "I need to test this on several more houses." Ilse was silent for a few seconds and then, unexpectedly even to herself, said, "Then do it. If this thing works, I will pray to your hammer." The younger daughter immediately added, "And to the pipe too." Weir, standing in the doorway, snorted. "Well then, Luan, you have almost become a shrine of the poor." He said it mockingly, but something warm flickered in his eyes. By evening, the whole workshop knew the news. Unofficially, of course. Rumors in the poor quarters spread faster than fire. Weir has found a way to heat a house without a fireplace. They say the pipe is hot even by the wall. Come on, they are lying. They are not lying. Ilse herself said the children got better. If it is true, it is a miracle. No, it is either a miracle or a deception, but better a miracle. Luan was so tired that his hands could not hold a cup. Yet inside there was a strange feeling. Not euphoria, not the joy of a winner, but something much stronger. First steps. He understood that one could reach a solution if one was not afraid of many mistakes. But he had not yet understood the most important thing. The real obstacle was not technical, it was political. The next day, a man in a gray cloak came to the workshop. Polite, dry, with good boots and nails too neat for a man who supposedly was just interested in the craft. He introduced himself as an advisor to the City Heat Committee. "I was told that you are experimenting with steam heating," he said, looking around the workshop as if he were already choosing what to take from it. Weir, standing by the wall, did not answer at once. Luan understood. The real trial was beginning now. The advisor smiled slightly. "The kingdom, of course, is interested in progress, but all such initiatives must pass through licensing. And licensing requires cooperation." He placed a thin parchment on the table. There were only 2 lines on it, but Luan immediately understood what they meant. Transfer all drawings and ownership rights to the invention to the crown. Receive a generous reward. In other words, give everything away. Weir slowly placed his palm on the table. "And if we do not agree?" The advisor was still smiling. "Then I would say that you are engaged in dangerous amateur activity. And dangerous amateur activity in winter especially quickly becomes grounds for arrest." Luan raised his head. And at that moment, the advisor saw for the first time in his gaze not a blacksmith's apprentice, but a person who had already once decided not to surrender. "I see," Luan said quietly. "So you did not come for the drawings?" "Of course for the drawings." "No," Luan shook his head. "You came to understand whether this can be stolen?" The advisor narrowed his eyes. The workshop became very quiet, and then Weir suddenly chuckled, shortly, dangerously. "Apprentice," he said, without taking his eyes off the official. "It seems the time has come to teach you not only how to work with a hammer, but also how to speak with those who want to leave the whole kingdom freezing for the sake of their power." Luan slowly clenched his healthy hand into a fist. He did not yet know that ahead there would be forgeries, sabotage, the first bribed workers, closed warehouses, and people ready to do anything for control over heat. But he had already understood the main thing. His heating system would become not just an invention. It would become a threat to the throne. And this is exactly where the real story would begin. Of course, I continue. Below is part 2, with a growing conflict, the first real obstacles, and the gradual revelation that Luan's invention can change not only winter but power itself in the kingdom. 4.txt+1. The advisor of the Heat Committee did not leave immediately. He stood in the workshop for another minute, looking at the drawings as if trying to memorize every line, every curve of the pipe, every mark made with coal on the floor. Then he slowly turned his gaze to Luan. "Young man," he said softly, almost kindly, "you seem not to understand the scale of the problem. There are too many people in the kingdom. Heat is not your toy. It is a resource, and resources must be under control." Luan stood beside the anvil, not lowering his gaze. "Are people also a resource?" he asked. The advisor smiled thinly. "People are part of order." Weir snorted loudly from his side of the workshop. "I do not need an order that turns children into corpses every winter." The advisor shook his head slightly. "Interference in heating regulations without a license will be regarded as a violation. I would not want a talented young man to have trouble." He said this politely, but a threat could already be felt in the air. Not obvious, not crude. The kind that is most dangerous of all. The smile of a person who is certain power is behind him. Luan suddenly understood that before him stood not just an official. Before him stood a man used to all innovations passing through his hands, and therefore through his payment, through his fears, through his profit. The advisor left and silence hung in the workshop. Then Weir spat to the side and said, "Excellent. Now you are on their list." "I was already on their list," Luan answered dryly. "It is just that before I was nobody." Weir smirked, but without amusement. "That was before you made warm air move through a pipe as if this were not winter but a stroll." Luan did not smile. He looked at the drawing. "They will try to take the idea." "They will try," Weir agreed. "And not only the idea. If they have enough sense, they will try to take you." Luan slowly ran his finger over the diagram. "Then we must make it so that taking it becomes impossible." The following days became a real school for him. Not a blacksmithing one, but an engineering one. He began small, with a separate room in the workshop which Weir allowed him to use as an experimental section. It had once been a pantry where coal, old tongs, and broken handles were stored. Now a boiler stood there, fixed on a stone base. From it ran a pipe of thick copper, wrapped with cloth in several places to reduce heat loss and protect from burns. But the main task was not for the pipe simply to heat. The main task was for the system to work steadily. Luan quickly understood that making hot steam move through a pipe was one thing, and making it safe, long-lasting, and without losses was quite another. First, he encountered 3 problems. The first was pressure difference. In the closed vat, water boiled, and the steam, lacking sufficient outlet, built up pressure too quickly. The lid began to twitch. If not for the valve made by Weir from old spring steel, everything could have ended in an explosion. The second was condensate. Steam passing through the pipe cooled unevenly. Water accumulated in the lower sections, and the pipe began to spit hot drops. This was dangerous both for people and for the structure itself. The third was heat distribution. One pipe heated one strip of the room too strongly, while the far part of the room remained cold. It was necessary either to extend the loop farther or to add additional heat release sections. From this, a new thought gradually was born. If the system were not just a pipe, but a chain. If hot steam passed through the main loop, then through side sections, and at the end returned back in cooled form to the lower collector, then heat could be used much more efficiently. Slowly, consistently, almost like breathing. Luan did not sleep for 2 nights in a row. Weir, noticing this, brought him tea and said, "You look as if you have already been boiled once in your own boiler." So far only mentally, Luan snapped. The old blacksmith smirked. "And what? Is there progress?" Luan looked at the written-over sheets. "There is an idea for returning condensate." Oh, Weir perked up. "Not just a steam pipe anymore, but a full loop?" "Yes, but one more element is needed." "What kind?" "An air brake and a reserve chamber. If pressure rises sharply, the steam must go not into the pipe, but into a safe cavity. Otherwise, in winter, we will either warm the house or send it into the sky." Weir laughed, then stroked his chin. "Now you sound like a real master." Luan looked at the boiler and already almost saw not copper and water, but the future. The system in Ilsa's house withstood the first 2 days. Then it failed. Not critically, but noticeably. On a cold morning, when the frost outside gnawed into the cracks of the walls, the pipe began to cool faster than Luan had calculated. The heat in the far corner of the room disappeared, and Ilsa woke again because her youngest son was coughing. She came to the workshop herself with a gray face but without reproach. "I am not complaining," she said. The children simply began to freeze again. Luan immediately threw on a sheepskin coat and went with Weir to inspect the installation. There he saw the problem. The outer wall through which the main section of the pipeline passed was taking away too much heat. It was necessary either to better insulate the pipe or move part of the loop inside the room, so that heat would be released where it was truly needed. He silently took off his gloves and checked the joints. "The issue is insulation," he said. "We are losing heat too quickly on the outer section." Ilsa looked at him anxiously. "Can this be fixed?" "Yes." "Today?" "Yes." Weir, already ready for the usual redo everything, only sighed. "I told you that you are too stubborn." By noon they raised the pipe, wrapped it with a layer of felt, then added another wooden casing with an air gap. It did not look beautiful, but it sharply increased efficiency. After startup, the system worked more evenly, and the warmth in the room became not merely noticeable, it became comfortable. Ilsa cried again, not because it was too good, because her youngest son fell asleep without coughing for the first time in many days. Luan turned away so she would not notice his lips trembling, and yet the joy did not last long. The next day, it was not officials who came to the workshop. Gray cloaks. 3 men, equally silent, equally composed, equally unpleasant. They wore no signs of the heat committee, but Luan immediately understood. These were the advisor's men. 2 clean boots, 2 identical gestures, 2 attentive gazes. One of them politely inclined his head. "We heard you are conducting an interesting experiment here." Weir, wiping his hands on a rag, answered, "Interesting is when a man orders a sword and receives a shovel. And here we have an ordinary workshop." "Then we were probably mistaken," said the gray cloak, looking straight at Luan. "But if a new heating system is really being created here, it would be useful for the Crown to study it. For the safety of the people, of course." Luan felt irritation rise inside him, colder than winter itself. "You are too late," he said. "It already works." The gray cloak smiled slightly. All the more so. At that moment, Luan understood. They had not come to ask, they had come to take. He took a step forward, and Weir immediately stood beside him, like an old wall of soot-blackened stone. "If you need a drawing," the old blacksmith said, "you will first have to explain on what grounds the Crown is trying to appropriate a private development made with personal funds and personal labor. Everything that improves the lives of subjects belongs to the Crown." The gray cloak answered without a shadow of embarrassment. It was at that very moment that a knock sounded outside. Not at the door, at the windows. Someone threw a stone at the glass, then another one. Shouts were heard outside. "Look, that is the very same steam house. They have warmth inside. They are hiding it." Luan stepped out to the threshold and saw that a crowd had already gathered in front of the workshop. Several neighbors, 2 craftsmen, boys, and 3 well-dressed people he had never seen before. One of them shouted something loudly. "The Council of Heat says this experiment is unsafe. They are using someone else's system. If it explodes, children will die." Luan understood everything at once. It was a setup. Clumsy, crude, but effective enough. First throw fear into the people, then offer protection, then take for oneself the right to decide who gets warm and who does not. And all of it under the guise of care. Weir cursed quietly. "There is your counsel." Luan looked at the crowd and felt everything inside grow cold. He had only wanted to give people heat, and received a war. He did not start arguing, did not start shouting. He did something else. He opened the door, showed the room, and said evenly so that everyone could hear, "Come in, look, touch, check. If you find a mistake, point it out. But if you have come simply to frighten people, say so at once." The crowd fell silent for a moment. The 3 gray cloaks exchanged glances. One of them entered first. He began to examine the boiler, the pipe, the joints, the heat insulation. Then he brought his palm to the metal section and raised his eyebrows in surprise. "The temperature is stable," he said. "But is it dangerous? Someone shouted from the street. Luan pointed at the valve. Here is the pressure release. Here is the reserve chamber. Here is the condensate return. If the fire is stronger, the system does not explode, but simply releases excess steam. If the pipe cools, heat returns to the loop. If you want, I will explain in more detail. He spoke calmly, and therefore people involuntarily listened. A boy from the crowd was the first to squeeze inside. He pressed his palm to the pipe, then to the wall, then to the floor, and opened his eyes wide. It really is warm here. After him came a woman, then an old man, then two more. People began to believe not words, but their own hands. The advisor understood that he was losing control of the situation and decided to act differently. He stepped forward and said loudly, "Hey, even if it is safe now, who will guarantee that the construction will not fail later? Who will be responsible for the consequences? Only a royal license can ensure order." Luan turned to him. "No," he said. "Order is ensured not by paper. Order is ensured by what works." The advisor narrowed his eyes. "You are very insolent for a blacksmith's apprentice, and you are too confident that fear is law." The words hung in the air, the crowd was silent, and exactly at that moment a sharp knock sounded from the neighboring house. Then another. People turned around. There, by Ilse's window, stood a girl and called, "Mama, the pipe is warm again." Brother woke up, and everything changed. One person from the crowd quietly stepped forward, then a second, then a third. "Can such a thing be made for us? How much does it cost? Is it true it will not explode? What if we help with copper?" The advisor understood that he had lost the most important thing, the monopoly on fear. Luan noticed this and, for the first time in the entire conversation, felt not joy but cold satisfaction. And yet he understood this was only the first battle. Victory in one quarter was not yet victory over the system. The night threat. That night, when the workshop finally grew quiet, Luan could not fall asleep for a long time. He lay on the wooden cot and listened to the frost cracking outside. The new heating system worked and the house was warm. But along with the warmth came another feeling, anxiety. He understood too well that power does not forgive those who teach people not to depend. Near morning, Weir woke him. "Get up." Luan opened his eyes. What happened? The old blacksmith stood by the door and his face was unusually grim. "Your gray guests came back, not alone, with people." Luan rose instantly. "How many?" "6, and one in a cloak with the seal of the heat committee. It looks like they want either to take the drawings or to break everything you built." Luan clenched his fist. "And if they fail?" Weir looked at him with a tired, heavy gaze. "Then they will try to break you." Luan silently threw on his clothes, took a hammer, and went out into the corridor. There, in the half-darkness, footsteps could already be heard. Slow, confident. The very footsteps of people who had come not for a conversation, but for the end of someone else's hope. And Luan understood for the first time. To give the kingdom heat, he would first have to stand in fire. "Yes, I will continue more slowly and with a larger volume at once." The footsteps behind the door sounded even and heavy, as if the people outside were not in a hurry at all. Luan stood in the corridor of the workshop, clutching a hammer, and listened to the snow creaking under boots. Weir silently stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, as if they were not a blacksmith and an apprentice, but two old soldiers before the final line. Behind their backs in the room, the boiler hissed quietly, and steady warmth was already moving through the copper pipes, still small but stubborn, like the first bonfire in a blizzard. Outside, someone knocked on the door without waiting for an answer. "Open up," said a male voice. "By order of the royal supervision." Luan looked at Weir. "Do not open until I say so," the old man answered quietly. "These are not guests. This is a test of weakness." They knocked on the door again, harder now. Then dry laughter rang out. "We have the right to enter. You are hiding an unregistered construction." Luan slowly exhaled and stepped toward the door. He was not going to hide. Too much had already been put at stake. Ilse, the children, the neighbors, this entire barely assembled system that, for the first time in many long years, gave people not a promise, but heat. Beside him, Weir took a heavy poker, and in the corner of the workshop a chain rang thinly. It was one of the fastening hooks, which had a slight looseness, shifting by itself from the vibration. Luan moved the bolt aside. 5 people stood on the threshold. 3 in gray cloaks, already familiar, and 2 city guards in winter helmets. Behind them were several more people, not in uniform, but with identical wooden clubs in their hands. All their faces were equally tense, as if they had been told in advance that inside was not a workshop, but an infectious outbreak. In front stood a man with the seal of the supervisory department on his chest. He was clean-shaven with thin lips and eyes, in which there was neither curiosity nor fear. Only the habit of giving orders. "Are you Luan?" he asked. "Yes. You are obliged to immediately provide the diagram of the heating construction and shut it down until inspection." "The inspection has already happened," Luan answered. The man tilted his head slightly. "An unofficial one does not count." "Then let the official one begin with a question," Luan said. "Did you come to check safety or to take the idea?" For a moment, silence hung on the threshold. One of the gray cloaks twitched as if to intervene, but the supervisor raised his palm and stopped him. "Young man," he said calmly, "you decide too quickly that power is standing against you, and power, unlike your boiler, does not cool down." "But power often overheats," Weir said from the side, "especially when someone else's thought is standing nearby, and it wants to be stolen." The supervisor turned his head toward the old blacksmith. "Are you Weir from the lower row? I am the one who fixes what you long ago forgot how to understand." His voice was hoarse, but in it there was not bravado, but tired contempt. The guards gripped their clubs tighter. Luan noticed that the supervisor barely noticeably glanced toward the window, toward where, through the glass, one could see part of the workshop and the copper pipe with insulation. He was assessing not only the system, but also the number of witnesses. Meanwhile, behind the backs of those who had come, neighbors were already gathering, people awakened by the noise. They did not come close, but they watched. And this was exactly what mattered. Power likes to work alone. It needs closed doors, quiet signatures, fear without witnesses. Now there were too many eyes around. The supervisor said, "I will repeat once more. You shut down the construction, show the drawings, and then we will decide whether the work may continue." "And if I refuse?" Luan asked. "Then we will seal the premises and deprive the quarter of heat." A quarter without a license has no right to an experiment. Luan felt something inside him very quietly, very evenly fall into place. He suddenly understood that arguing further was pointless. They had not come to him. They had come to check whether the very fact of his success could be suppressed. If he stepped back today, tomorrow not 5 would come here, but 20. Then 40. Then they would burn down the workshop, declaring it care for the population. He looked the supervisor in the eyes. "Then you will enter only over my dead body." Old Weir quietly whistled. The supervisor's face almost did not change. Only his voice became colder. "Careful. For such words one can lose freedom." "Freedom," Weir said with a crooked smirk, "is when children sleep not from exhaustion, but from warmth." The crowd behind the officials began to stir. Someone coughed. Someone quietly said to a neighbor, "Our home is freezing too." This was still little, but already enough for the tension to become viscous. The supervisor gave a sign to the guards. They stepped forward. Luan did not wait for them to enter. He sharply stepped to the left, at the same time striking the metal post by the entrance with his hammer. Not the guard, the post. A deafening ring sounded, and the heavy chain, stretched under the ceiling for lifting blanks, broke loose from the latch. It crashed down right between Luan and the first guard, forcing him to recoil. Weir, at that same instant, hurled the poker at the other one and rushed to the side door to prevent them from going around the workshop from the rear. It was not an attack, but a precise, desperately calculated defense of a home they had built not from stone, but from stubbornness. One of the gray cloaks pulled out a short rod. A pale blue sign flared at its end, and a cold impulse ran through the room. Restraining magic. Luan felt the air become denser for a second. Not freezing cold, but heavy, interfering with movement. "Down!" Weir shouted. Luan managed to duck. A narrow glass capsule flew over his head and shattered against the wall, spilling white smoke. Not poison, a slowing powder. It stuck to the skin and slowed movement. Luan cursed and threw the hammer at the nearest guard. He dodged but lost his step, and Weir used the moment and struck him on the wrist with the poker. A crunch sounded. The club fell from the guard's fingers and he howled. But there were too many of them. 2 were already coming in from the other side. A third guard drew a knife and went straight at Luan, aiming not at the chest, but at the arm. They clearly wanted to take him alive. And then something happened that no one expected. A loud child's scream came from the room. "Mama, there are strangers." Luan went cold for a moment. Ilsa and the children. They were there. The guard who had almost reached him was also distracted for a second. That second was enough. Luan turned and struck him in the jaw with the handle of the hammer with all his strength. He collapsed onto one knee. With the next movement, Luan pulled a red-hot iron rod from the stand, the one usually used to bend horseshoes, and held it forward like an improvised spear. The supervisor took half a step back. "Enough," he said. And there was no calm in his voice anymore, only irritation. "You attacked representatives of the law." Luan was breathing heavily. "You came to break the heat in a house where children are sick. What else should that be called?" The supervisor did not answer. He simply raised his hand, and the gray cloak again began to trace the suppression sign. At that moment, the door from inside swung open. Ilsa stood on the threshold, pale in a woolen cloak, with 2 children behind her back. She saw the smoke, the strangers, the blood on the floor, and her face became whiter than cloth. "What is happening?" she asked. The supervisor shifted his gaze to her. "Citizen, step aside. Your workshop is illegal." Ilsa did not step back. She looked first at him, then at Luan, then at the child who was holding onto her skirt. Then quietly but very distinctly she said, "If it were illegal, I would already have buried my son." This phrase proved stronger than any shout. The crowd beyond the threshold stirred. Someone stepped closer. A woman in a woolen scarf said, "It works in my home too." Another, "And in ours." A man with a gray beard shook his head. "They are not lying. It has become warmer here." Luan saw something like anxiety flicker in the supervisor's eyes for the first time, not because the system was dangerous, but because people had begun to confirm its value themselves. And when people see benefit with their own hands, bureaucratic fear loses its power. But the supervisor was too experienced to lose in front of everyone at once. "This construction cannot be accepted without a failure test," he said harshly. We are obliged to confiscate a sample." "A sample?" Luan asked again. "Or the whole thing? Do not be insolent. Then do not lie." Silence stretched tight. And then Weir unexpectedly laughed, shortly, dryly, angrily. "Listen, official, you do not even understand what is standing in front of you right now. This is not just a pipe with steam. This is a way to make life bearable. And you came with a seal and clubs as if you could lock winter in a pantry." The supervisor turned away to the guards. "Arrest him." But the arrest did not happen, because someone in the crowd said very quietly, "And if we do not allow it?" And if we do, the supervisor slowly turned around. The very old neighbor who once brought Luan nails stepped forward. Behind him was a woman with 2 girls, then several more people. They had no weapons, no uniform, cheap coats, and frostbitten hands. But exactly because of that, they looked more dangerous than the guards. "This is our quarter," the old man said, "and if you touch the workshop, we will not disperse." One guard laughed. "A crowd against the law? Funny." "No," said another voice from the crowd. "People against someone who wants to take away heat." Luan looked at them and could not immediately believe it. He had not asked them to interfere. He had not called anyone for help. But here they stood, and this was far more important than victory in a fight. The supervisor understood this before anyone else. He slowly lowered his hand. "You do not know what you are getting involved in." "But we know what we are freezing in," Ilsa answered. This time even the guards exchanged glances, because there was doubt in their eyes too. They had come as people of order, but saw children who truly did not sleep at night from the cold. And it is hard to be angry at those who simply want to warm a home. The supervisor raised his chin. "Final warning, disperse." No one moved. And then from the far end of the street came a dull rumble. Everyone turned around. A cart drawn by 2 horses was moving slowly along the road. On it stood barrels and boxes covered with frost. A royal seal was burned onto its side. Weir narrowed his eyes. Oh, wonderful. Reinforcements. But Luan suddenly noticed that there were no ordinary guards on the cart. Only one person in an expensive cloak, wrapped up to the chin. He jumped down into the snow, carefully shook off his sleeve, and headed toward them. His face was gray from the cold, but not from fear. More from irritation, as if he had been interrupted on some important errand. The supervisor immediately straightened. Lord Third Chancellor. The crowd fell silent. Luan felt that the situation had abruptly changed. If a person of such rank had arrived here, then the dispute from the workshop had gone far beyond the quarter. The Chancellor came closer, looked at the broken chain, at the smoke, at the crowd, at the children, and finally at the pipe with warm steam. His gaze lingered on it the longest. "So it is true," he said. The supervisor hurriedly spoke. "We arrived to confiscate an illegal installation, Lord Chancellor. The authors of the construction refused to provide the diagram." The Chancellor raised his hand. "Not now." Then he looked at Luan. "Was it you who proposed the heat return system?" "Yes," Luan answered. "And does it work?" "It works. Without magical crystals?" "Yes. Without constant fuel increase?" "Yes." The Chancellor slowly nodded. His face remained unreadable, but something new appeared in his voice. Interest mixed with caution. "Then perhaps we were wrong in our approach." The supervisor sharply turned to him. "Lord Chancellor, this is a private initiative. If the Crown does not take it under control now, tomorrow the Quarter will begin installing such systems arbitrarily." The Chancellor looked at him almost lazily. "And what is bad about that?" The supervisor froze. The Chancellor continued, "I have just driven through 3 districts. In 2, the stoves are cold. In 1, children are coughing as if they will cough up their lungs. And you came to the man who gave them heat with the intention of sealing everything?" He spoke quietly, but every word struck more precisely than a hammer. The supervisor turned pale. "Our task is safety." "Safety," the Chancellor interrupted, "is when the people do not die because you failed to prepare a paper in time." Then he turned to Luan. "And yet, young master, you must understand. If this device really is so effective, it cannot be left without supervision." Luan did not answer immediately. He saw where everything was going. The Chancellor was not his ally. He was simply smart enough to understand. Burning the discovery was foolish. It was far more profitable to appropriate it carefully. "I understand," Luan said. "Good. But I will not give the drawing to those who came to break it with a club." The Chancellor smiled slightly. "And if the Crown offers protection and a workshop? Then I will think about it." The supervisor flared up. "Lord Chancellor, you cannot—" "I can," the man said dryly. "And you, it seems, no longer can." The rest of the night passed in a strange, tense half-silence. The guards were recalled. The gray cloaks disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Before leaving, the supervisor threw Luan such a look that it was clear. This was not the end. But neither was it victory over him, just a temporary retreat. "Stay." The Chancellor, on the contrary, stayed. He entered the workshop, inspected the device, asked for the drawings to be brought, then twice asked the same question about the safety of the valve and the condensate loop. He was not stupid. He truly wanted to understand how workable this was. And when Luan patiently explained everything, for the first time in the entire conversation, the Chancellor began to look at him not as a craftsman, but as a person capable of changing an entire fuel market. Finally, he said, "Tomorrow morning I will send a commission, not a supervisory one, a technical one. If the system is confirmed, you will receive a temporary license for a demonstration quarter." Weir snorted. Temporary, generous. The Chancellor paid him no attention. "But there is a condition." Luan raised his eyes. "What condition?" "You will not sell the drawing to private homes without approval, at least until we understand how this will affect the coal tax, wood distribution, and the supply of the northern districts." Luan understood at once this was not only care. This was fear of losing control over the market. "If you want a monopoly," he said, "call it that honestly." The Chancellor looked directly at him. "I do not want a monopoly. I want the kingdom not to fall apart when the old suppliers begin lobbying for supply disruptions. If your system really allows dependence on the northern mines to be reduced, do you think their owners will be happy?" Luan remained silent, because the answer was already clear. The Chancellor added, You are not the first to bring convenience into the world, but sometimes convenience is more dangerous than a sword, especially if it changes what the powerful live on. With these words, he left, leaving behind not a solution but a new, subtler threat. When the door closed behind the last person, the workshop seemed to exhale. Ilsa tiredly leaned against the doorframe. The children were already asleep on the bench, pressed against each other. Weir silently sat on a stool and looked into the fire in the boiler for a long time. Luan stood by the window and watched as a pale winter morning began above the rooftops. The snow in the rays of dawn glittered as if the whole world were made of squeezed light. Ilsa was the first to break the silence. Will they come back? Luan did not lie. Yes. Will they take everything? They will try. And what will you do? He looked at the pipe through which the warm breath of the boiler now moved slowly, then at the sleeping children, then at Weir. Make the system better, he said, and faster, so they do not have time to strangle it. Weir snorted. Finally, a normal answer. Ilsa wiped her eyes and smiled weakly. Then I will bring more blankets, and ask the neighbors to help insulate the walls. Luan nodded. He understood that that night he had not simply protected the workshop. He had done something more. He had shown people that heat did not have to be begged for. It could be built, with their own hands, together. And this was exactly what was most dangerous for those who were used to controlling cold like a weapon. Outside the window, the first people slowly passed by. Someone was going to work. Someone was dragging a bucket of water. Someone was carrying firewood on a sled. Some, seeing the light in the workshop, stopped and looked with hope. Not with admiration yet, but no longer with distrust either. Luan suddenly felt that now it was not about one pipe and not one house. This was the first stone, and walls would surely follow it, and the walls would have to be protected. By noon, the technical commission arrived. Not supervisors in gray cloaks, but 3 engineers, 1 archivist, and a boilermaster from the royal department. They were cautious but already without open aggression. Luan showed them the system, explained the loop, the valves, the insulation, the condensate return, and the distribution of heat through sections. They asked inconvenient questions, checked calculations, asked to repeat the startup, and each time the system held. By evening, not only the commission stood in the workshop. Neighbors had come too, and those who yesterday had been afraid even to say the word heat aloud. Someone brought tea. Someone brought cloth for insulation. Someone brought a piece of copper removed from an old roofing line. It already looked less like a workshop and more like the beginning of a small quarter alliance. And over all of this hung the same feeling. The country did not yet know that its winter had just lost its first support. And someone would certainly try to put it back. But now Luan had what he had not had yesterday. Not only an idea, not only a mechanism, he had people. And that changed everything. I continue. The technical commission spent almost the entire day in the workshop. They came with the appearance of people who were prepared in advance to find a mistake, but the longer they looked at the system, the more noticeably their behavior changed. At first they asked dry questions, then began to ask again about details. Then one of the engineers even asked Luan to repeat the heat flow diagram on a separate sheet. By the end of the day, it became clear. This was no longer doubt, but professional respect that they themselves had not yet had time to acknowledge. The Chancellor did not appear personally, but his influence was felt in everything. The Commission acted cautiously without rough pressure, as if they had been ordered not to break but to understand. Luan saw this and did not relax. He knew too well that in such cases the kindness of power was often simply another form of control. Today they listen to you, tomorrow they register you. The day after tomorrow they put their signature on what you invented. Weir, who usually hated any paper conversations, surprisingly stayed close and did not allow anyone to knock Luan out of rhythm. When one of the officials tried to steer the conversation toward tax consequences and royal participation, the old blacksmith said with dry irritation, "We will talk about taxes after you learn not to freeze people in winter." This caused a brief pause, and then even the archivist, a young woman with a sharp chin and carefully gathered hair, could not hold back a smile. Luan noticed this and slightly released his inner tension. But only slightly, because he already understood. The system could be recognized, it could be accepted, it might even begin to spread. And still, that did not mean it would be left in his hands. The inspection was painful not because of distrust, but because of the number of requirements. The engineers asked to show the temperature at the inlet and outlet of the loop. They checked how quickly the boiler reached operating mode. They noted that heat was distributed too unevenly in the far corner, but admitted that this was a problem not of the idea but of the room's layout. The archivist separately recorded every measurement, every signature, every correction. Luan understood that if even one figure was officially fixed, it would later be difficult to distort it. This was his first small victory. When they tested the system with the window open to see how quickly the temperature dropped, one engineer named Resar said gloomily, "The losses are lower than we expected. Much lower." "Because you expected not a system, but a homemade pipe," Luan answered. "And yet," another said, "in this form it could be installed in the dormitory of the crafts quarter." Luan nodded. It could, if the diameter of the main loop is increased and the reserve chamber is moved outside. He himself did not notice how the conversation shifted from allow or not to how to scale. And this was important. At some point, people with seals stopped talking down to him. They began discussing the technology as something real, almost inevitable. But it was exactly then that the question sounded, the one Luan had been waiting for from the very beginning. "Who owns the rights to the construction?" the archivist asked without raising her eyes from the sheet. The workshop fell silent. Luan slowly placed the tool on the table. "I do." The woman raised her head. "Not the workshop? No, not Weir? No, not the city council?" Luan looked directly at her. "No." She marked something in the papers and calmly said, "Then you will need a separate registration of the invention." Weir immediately snorted. "There it is. It has begun." The archivist was not offended. "This is not seizure. This is order." "Order," Weir repeated, "is when the cold cannot wait until you register it." Luan intervened before the conversation slid again into familiar fury. "I will submit an application," he said. "That is reasonable," the archivist answered. "But you must understand. After that, not only officials will pay attention to you. The coal and wood market has long been occupied by people who do not benefit from houses having a cheaper way of heating." Luan was not surprised. He had expected this from the second the system worked in Ilsa's house. "Then I will have opponents." "Yes, does it depend on success?" "On scale," she said. "If you limit yourself to one quarter, it will be considered a local innovation. If you begin installing the system in several districts, resistance will begin." Resar, the engineer with a short mustache, added, "And the resistance will not only be official." Luan understood that they were telling him almost openly. There would be attempts at bribery, pressure, sabotage, perhaps burned warehouses, perhaps false accusations, perhaps something worse. He did not ask why the commission was telling him this specifically. It was already clear. They had already seen that he was not just a craftsman, but a person who could think faster than fear. The next day, new people came to the workshop. Not officials, not guards, not gray cloaks. Representatives of the neighboring quarter came. First two carpenters, then a woman who owned a cloth shop, then the senior locksmith from the northern workshops. All of them had heard about Ilsa's warm house, about the children no longer coughing at night, and wanted to understand whether the same could be done for them. They came not for the drawings as prey, but as people who cared. Luan showed them the working unit, explained the principle of steam movement, told them why the condensate return and mainline insulation were important. They listened very attentively like students, but they had another expression too, gratitude mixed with hope. The woman with the cloth named Marna quietly said, "2 old people live in our house. If this really works, we will be able to survive this winter." Luan nodded. "It will work if it is done properly. And if improperly, then the boiler will heat not people but walls." Marna smirked and looked at him very seriously. "Then teach us properly." This was no longer just an appeal. It was a request for the transfer of knowledge. Luan felt that right now his project was ceasing to be his personal matter. It was turning into a craft network, into a small movement for survival. And there was something dangerous in this for those who were used to monopolistically distributing heat, coal, and fear. Weir, who had been watching what was happening, came closer to him and said quietly, "If you start teaching others, they will leak your method. Be ready for that, I know." "And you will continue anyway?" Luan looked at the people by the boiler. If I do not continue, they will freeze. The old blacksmith was silent for a long time, and then only snorted. You are a stubborn boy. You say that as an insult, Luan dryly noted. No, Weir answered, as the best thing you have. 3 days after the commission's visit, a new messenger came to the workshop. He was not from the heat committee and not from the supervisors. Dressed expensively with soft boots and a thin ring on his finger, he represented that very coal market they had been warned about. He had a smiling voice, smooth movements, and 2 calm eyes, the eyes of a man who had come to buy if he could not steal. Mr. Luan? He asked, inclining his head slightly. Allow me to congratulate you. Your system has made an impression. And what do you want? Weir asked at once. The messenger smiled. Reasonable cooperation. Our enterprises are ready to finance mass production of components. In return, we would like to receive the exclusive right to supply fuel for your heating loop. Luan looked at him and immediately understood the trap. It was beautifully packaged strangulation. If he agreed, the heating would remain, but dependence on the coal houses would not disappear. Instead of selling heating stoves directly, they would sell you the right to continue using what you had created. No, Luan said. The messenger was not even surprised. You probably want to hear a more profitable figure. I want to hear why you think I need your consent. The messenger continued smiling. Because without our supply network, you will not be able to expand. I will. More slowly. But I will. The messenger's smile did not falter. Then perhaps we can discuss other forms of influence. For example, who will finance your materials? Who will approve quarter permits? Who will protect the workshop if accidental fires begin around it? He pronounced the last word so softly that it sounded more frightening than a direct threat. Luan understood. This was the real power of the city. Not swords and not seals, but the ability to make it so that any new undertaking of yours accidentally does not survive until morning. Weir stepped forward. Get out. The messenger looked at him with almost lazy regret. Old man, I am offering profit, and you behave as if I brought the plague. The plague also likes to talk about profit, Weir answered. Luan did not waste time on arguments. He simply took a folder with calculations from the table and placed it before the messenger. Tell your masters this, I do not sell them the rights to heat. Then you will lose support, let it be. And protection. Then we will protect ourselves. The messenger smiled a little wider, but now it was already a cold smile. You are too young to understand how the city works. Luan raised his voice for the first time in the conversation. And you are too used to the city not being able to live without you. This time the smile vanished from the messenger's face almost instantly. He silently took the folder, bowed slightly, and left, without slamming the door, without raising his voice. And that was the worst of all, because such a person does not threaten in the moment. He remembers. On the 3rd day, official confirmation of registration arrived. Not a full license, but the temporary status of Pilot Public Heating Solution. The wording was long and boring, like all royal documents. But the essence was important. The workshop was not being closed. The system was not being confiscated. Luan received the right to continue work in one demonstration quarter under the supervision of the Technical Commission. This was not a victory in the pure sense, but it was far more important. It was legal existence. Weir, after reading the paper, did not say a word for a long time. Then suddenly he said, I hate it when they manage to be reasonable. Luan almost smiled. So do I. However, he did not allow himself to rejoice too soon, because paper is only a shield until the first crack. He urgently needed to solve 2 things: expanding the system without losses and protection from sabotage. He began with the technical solution. The drawings again lay on the table. Luan understood that one system for one house was already proof. But if he wanted to hold support against the pressure of the coal houses, he needed a more universal module. Not a huge unified network at once, but small loops that could be quickly connected to different buildings. He came up with a 3-part scheme. The first unit was a common boiler with a reinforced valve. The second was a distribution block, through which heat went into different rooms through separate pipes. The third was a return loop for condensate and emergency release so that under overload the system would not tear the main line. plus a separate insulating box made of wood, felt, and a thin sheet of metal so that the street section would not eat half the energy. This was not just an engineering improvement. It was a step towards standardization. And standardization in such a world is almost revolution. Weir, looking at the diagram, whistled. You do not want to make heating. You want to make a network. Luan did not raise his eyes. Yes. And you understand that this is already an entirely different matter? I understand. Then they will begin to fear you even more. Luan took the charcoal pencil and added another mark to the diagram. Let them. Weir shook his head, but already with that expression an old master has when the apprentice finally stops playing and begins to build for real. At night, what Luan had expected, but still did not want to see, happened. First, one of the boys helping with preparations noticed tracks in the snow by the rear wall of the workshop. Then Weir found a thin, almost invisible cut on the outer insulation of the pipe. Someone had tried to damage the loop in such a way that it would look like natural wear. No explosion, no spectacular destruction, just a gradual drop in efficiency that could then be presented as proof that it did not work. Weir cursed so loudly that the children immediately recoiled. So it has begun. Luan crouched beside the pipe and carefully examined the cut. It was neat, almost professional. Not the guards, not street hooligans. Someone who knew what they were doing. It is the market, he said. Weir clenched his fists, or the supervisors through stand-ins. Luan ran his finger over the cut and rose. It does not matter. What matters is that now they will act secretly. He turned to the people who had been working beside him all this time. Marna, 2 carpenters, the old locksmith, the boy who carried coal, and Ilsa, who helped with insulation. Their faces were tense but not frightened. Listen carefully, Luan said. From today we change the order of storing and checking pipes. No one stays alone by the outer wall. Every new part is checked twice. If you see an unfamiliar person near the workshop, you immediately call Weir or me. Marna frowned. Can they come back? Yes, and what then? Luan looked at the people and answered as simply as possible. Then we will see them first. At that moment, he felt for the first time that he was no longer alone. A week later, the first 3 heating loops were already working in the houses of the demonstration quarter. It was slow, modest, without ceremony. But on the streets where children had once walked with blue noses and red hands, warm windows now began to appear. People did not stop complaining about the frost, but they stopped being afraid of the night. One old woman brought Luan apples and said, I do not believe politicians, but I believe heat. Luan silently took the apples and bowed. It was then that he understood. People rarely believe abstract promises, but they remember very well who gave them the chance not to die quietly in their sleep. Weir, looking at this, said without his usual sarcasm, for the first time in a long while, You did it. Luan looked at the warm windows. For now, only the beginning. The old man nodded. A beginning because of which one day they will want either to buy you or bury you. Luan did not answer at once. Then we will have to make it too expensive to buy. Weir snorted. Now that is a conversation. And yet behind this small success, the shadow of the next blow could be felt. Because in such stories, the enemy never sleeps for long. When an innovation begins bringing people real benefit, attention is inevitably paid to it not only by those who want to earn money, but also by those who fear losing power. And that meant that ahead were not only new workshops, but also new obstacles. I continue. The first signs of a new problem appeared not in the workshop, but on the street. First, one delivery of copper disappeared. Then 2 workers from the neighboring quarter did not come to the morning shift. Then Luan noticed that strangers began appearing too often near the stacked pipes. Not guards and not officials, but people in simple dark cloaks who looked too closely at the drawings and stood too long beside the carts. They did not threaten openly. They simply measured the space with the gaze of people tasked with understanding exactly where to strike so that everything would fall apart. Weir was the first to say aloud what Luan already suspected. Coalmen. Luan raised his head from the diagram. Are you sure? In this city they smell not of coal, but of money. And fear. That is their style. He stood by the table, leaning his palm on the forged edge, and looked as if he was ready to take up the hammer again, not for work, but for a fight. Luan understood his state. Weir was from that generation of masters that had managed to see profit gradually bend craft beneath itself. For him, the coal houses were not simply fuel suppliers. They were a system that had long stopped being honest. Luan silently gathered the drawing and said, "So they have already begun." "Of course they have begun." Weir smirked gloomily. "First they take the delivery, then they delay the iron. Then they come to you with a smile and explain that without their help, you will get nowhere." Luan walked around the room and stopped by the window. Outside, the air was frosty, but now the quarter had a different mood. Warmth glowed in the windows. People began lingering by doors not with fuss, but with curiosity. What had once seemed impossible was already here, and exactly this made the situation dangerous. The coalmen could not allow this to become normal. "They will put pressure on the suppliers," Luan said, "and on those who help us assemble the loops." "And on us," Weir added. Luan nodded. Then he took off his gloves and thought for a moment. His system was good enough to interest the authorities, but still too small to protect itself on its own. What was needed was not just a drawing. What was needed was a channel of trust. People had to understand that this was not someone else's game, but their own chance to survive. "We will expand the list of craftsmen," he said, "but only those whom the neighbors know." Meaning not random apprentices and not those sent from above? Exactly. Weir snorted with satisfaction. "Finally, you speak like a man whose idea has already been almost stolen once." Luan smiled weakly, but inside he did not relax. He already felt it. A blow would come soon. And this blow would not be against the pipe, but against the people. The coal market was located in the lower part of the city, closer to the warehouses and docks. It was always dirtier, noisier, and colder there than in the residential quarters. Black dust covered the roofs of the shops. Sellers stood with hands reddened by the wind, and carts brought sacks of coal almost without stopping. It was there that Luan and Weir appeared 2 days after the first signs of sabotage. They needed to understand who was cutting off the copper supplies. And almost immediately it became clear the issue was not the goods themselves. The issue was distribution. At the warehouse gate stood 2 people in expensive fur cloaks. Not guards, not merchants in the usual sense. They spoke with the manager as if they had owned the place for a long time already. When Luan approached, one of them, tall with smoothly combed hair and a narrow face, turned his gaze to him. "So this is the inventor?" The manager, rubbing his hands, nodded awkwardly. "Yes, sir. That is him." The man in the fur cloak inclined his head slightly. Curious. Luan stopped a few steps away. "What do we owe the honor to?" The man smiled with the corner of his mouth. "My name is Oren. I represent the House of Northern Coal. We have heard that you want to build heating systems without our materials." Weir quietly muttered under his breath. "So the carriers of the smell have arrived." Luan did not look away. "I want to build working systems. I can buy materials from anyone." Oren slowly clasped his fingers behind his back. "In theory, yes. In practice, no. All quality copper for the next 2 months has already been allocated." Luan immediately understood that this was a lie. Not too crude to be laughable, but confident enough to be presented as the state of the market. "And you came to tell me this personally?" "We came to offer help," Oren answered. There was no aggression in his voice, only the smooth confidence of a man used to turning any problem into a contract. "Help with what?" Luan asked. "With scaling, with supplies, with protection from sabotage." Weir gave a short laugh. "Funny." Oren looked at him with polite coldness. "If you allow me, I will continue. The House of Northern Coal is ready to provide you with materials, people, and warehouse space. In exchange, we want participation in the project and the right of priority sale of heating modules to those quarters where our coal is already used." Luan did not answer at once. Too obvious a trap. Too familiar a formula. Help on the outside, dependence on the inside. If he agreed, then after a couple of months, all the houses would believe that the heating had been built, thanks to the coal house. And after that, it would no longer matter whose idea it had been. What mattered was who controlled the supply chain. "No," Luan said. "Oren seemed to have been waiting for this. That is unreasonable. Perhaps. Your invention will not survive without the market. Then apparently I will have to build another market." For a moment, something changed in Oren's eyes. Very quickly, very subtly. Not anger, calculation. He reassessed Luan and apparently decided that the boy was more dangerous than he looked. "Young man," he said almost kindly, "there are many capable people in this city, but ability does not remove the need for allies." "And do the coal houses know how to be allies?" Weir asked. Oren smiled. "We know how to be useful." "That is not the same thing," Luan said. Oren slightly inclined his head, accepting the answer without argument. "Then perhaps later you will come to us yourself, when you understand that supplies are impossible without our participation." Luan watched him as he walked away through the dirty snow toward the warehouses and felt cold anger rising inside. He did not like meaningless conflicts, but he liked it even less when people sold their own monopoly under the guise of care. The problem with the copper was uncovered in the evening. One of the workers brought a cart with partially cut sheets intended for distribution boxes. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary delay, but Luan immediately noticed the nature of the damage. The cuts were too precise, and the marks at the joints showed that someone at the warehouse had not merely damaged the goods, but had deliberately switched the set. "This is not a defect," he said quietly. Weir frowned. "What exactly?" Luan ran his finger along the edge of one sheet. "They left only half of it. Part of the copper has already gone to another order. Impossible. Possible. Someone is changing deliveries on the fly." He stood up and sharply asked the cart driver, "Who prepared the invoices?" The man shivered in fear. "I do not know. We were told to reload part of the goods onto another warehouse." The seal was correct. Luan quickly understood the scheme. Not direct theft, but redistribution through forged permits. Less noise, fewer traces, fewer reasons for an official investigation. "Where was the seal from?" Weir asked. The cart driver hesitated, then forced out, "Through an intermediary. From the coal house." The workshop became completely quiet for a second. This was no longer a threat, it was an attack on the supply chain. And if it was not stopped now, projects in several houses would stop by themselves. Luan looked at the map of the quarter, at the piled pipes, at the list of future connections, at the people who had already put their strength into this. He understood that now, it was not simply the market working against him. A whole structure was working against him, one that knew how to apply pressure without shouting. "We need to go higher," he said. Weir raised an eyebrow. "Higher is where?" Luan slowly folded the map. "To the person who signed their access to the warehouses." The chancery greeted them with cold stone and long corridors. There was no wind there, as at the market. But it was much colder. Because within these walls, winter was not nature, but a principle. At first, the secretary at the entrance wanted not to let them in. Then, after seeing the temporary license and the commission's signature, reluctantly reported that they would be received in an hour. Luan and Weir spent this time on a bench in a side hall, where portraits of former advisors hung. Each had the same serious faces and the same dead eyes. "I hate places like this," Weir muttered. Luan remained silent. He also disliked this silence. It was not empty, but learned. The silence of a room where words are spoken only so that one can later refer to a signature. When they were finally called in, a young administrator named Levon was sitting behind the desk. Too neat, too clean, with thin fingers and a quick gaze. He looked like a man who was not completely sure of his strength, but was sure of his chair. "Mr. Luan," he began without greeting, "I have been informed about problems with supplies." "That is exactly why we are here," Luan said. "Who gives the coal house the right to change our orders?" Levin made a small pause. "Temporary logistics measures. Demand in the city is unstable. Materials are redistributed in the interests of general order." Weir snorted. The interests of general order very conveniently coincided with the interests of the coal house. Levon looked at him without expression. "Threats to the supplies of heating modules may lead to the disruption of a public project. We cannot allow chaos." Luan leaned forward. "Then why did you not stop the substitution at the warehouse?" "I did not say there was one. We have samples and the cart driver's signatures. Signatures can be forged. Then check the seal. Seals can be forged too." For a second, Luan felt irritation so sharp that it became almost funny. Before him sat a man who was not protecting order, but hiding someone else's scheme behind endless maybes. "You are closing your eyes to sabotage," he said directly. Levin placed his fingers on the table. I make sure that royal structures do not conflict with one another. So the coal house is your structure? For a moment, Levin remained still. Then he answered, the coal house is a useful partner. Luan understood everything completely. It was not necessarily that Levin himself took bribes. Perhaps he was simply afraid to touch those who fed half the city. But fear and participation look almost the same in the end. So you will not help, Luan said. I will help within the procedure. Weir stood up, not hiding his contempt. Procedure is when winter has already arrived and you are still looking for the right form for a piece of paper. Levin did not answer. Luan rose after him. Then remember one thing, he said calmly. If you do not stop the substitution, we will begin publishing all our accounts and all delays by quarter. People should know who is leaving them without heat. Levin raised his eyebrow slightly. That already looks like pressure. No, Luan said. That is defense. They left the chancery with the feeling that they had achieved nothing. And yet Luan no longer felt defeated. Because although Levin had not helped, he now knew that pressure from above existed. And that meant it was possible to strike not only from below, but also at reputation. The next morning, a notice board appeared by the workshop. An ordinary wooden panel on which the list of orders had previously been posted. Now Luan personally nailed to it a sheet with 3 columns: supply, date, status. In the first column, the order for copper and insulation. In the second, the promised date. In the third, the actual receipt. The first 2 lines filled immediately, the third later. Then he added another table, the number of people who had received a warm module, the number of houses where children had stopped coughing, the number of repair requests. At first, people around looked cautiously, then more and more often stopped and read. It was a simple solution, almost crude, but very strong. When information goes out onto the street, it becomes harder to manipulate it. Weir, seeing the board, only shook his head. You are exposing them to the light. Yes, and they do not like that. Too bad for them. By noon, a crowd had already gathered by the board. People saw which supplies had been delayed and who was indirectly responsible. Some began to curse, others brought spare materials. Still others offered their help in assembling the loop. And then Luan understood. Transparency works better than any propaganda. As soon as people saw the scheme, they themselves became part of the defense. But exactly this made him even more dangerous to his opponents. Oren came in the evening, without an entourage, without demonstrative guards, only him and one silent assistant. He stood by the notice board, reading the figures, and his face was unreadable. You are building yourself an audience very quickly, he said at last. Luan did not raise his head from the fastening screw, and you are turning supplies into a tool of pressure very quickly. Oren smiled slightly. I did not come to argue, I came to warn you. Luan stopped. About what? About the fact that you call things by their names too loudly. People like that, but it irritates those who hold the warehouse keys. Weir, standing by the wall, snorted. He already understands. Oren shifted his gaze to the old man. Then you know that one day your materials may accidentally burn, or the workshop will be declared unsafe, or your workers will suddenly discover that they have been accused of illegal use of city property. Luan looked at him without emotion. And this is your way of helping? This is my way of saying that you have reached the level where people no longer apply pressure only by buying. Luan slowly straightened. And what do you want in return? Oren was silent for a long time, then said, a share. No, not money. No, a share in supplies. We are ready to provide you with copper at a fixed price if you stop publishing data that compromises our warehouses. Luan understood at once. Not simply pressure, but an attempt to make him part of the chain, so that he himself would soften the blow against the coal people. So you want me to hide the problem, he said. I want us not to destroy each other on the eve of winter. Luan looked at the notice board. You have already begun. Oren clenched his jaw for a moment. You are stubborn. I build heat. Stubbornness is useful here. Oren stepped closer and lowered his voice. Then I will say it directly. If you continue expanding so quickly, the city will begin to divide into those who are with you and those who are against you. And believe me, the side against you will be richer. Luan answered just as quietly, and the side for me is hungrier, and therefore stronger. It was an honest answer, and apparently it was precisely this that affected Oren most of all. The rich know how to count, but poorly understand what necessity does to people. And Luan had already seen it. People who are given heat begin to change. They fear less and help each other more. A city like that is much harder to buy. Oren left without a threat, and that was much worse than a threat. That night, Luan almost did not sleep. He sat in the workshop and rechecked the joints, the supply list, the workers' logs, and the installation schedule. Weir had left earlier to go around the nearest houses and check whether there were strangers near the warehouses. Ilsa stayed to help with insulation, although the children were already asleep. Outside, snow fell in large, quiet flakes, and the whole quarter looked as if the city itself wanted to pretend to be harmless. But Luan knew. If the coal people decided to strike, they would not make noise. They would strike where it hurt most. Perhaps at the children. Perhaps at the supplies. Perhaps at the documents. Or at his very name. When he had almost finished checking, the workshop door quietly opened. A boy courier entered, breathless and pale. "Mr. Luan?" He breathed out. "At the warehouse gates, there are people." Luan rose instantly. "What people?" The courier swallowed. "I do not know, but they are saying that all your pipes are dangerous, and that tonight there will be an inspection with sealing." Weir, just then returning in the doorway, cursed grimly. So it has started. Luan threw on his cloak. "How many of them?" "Many, and guards are with them." Luan looked at Ilsa. She stood very straight, though not a drop of blood remained in her face. "You will stay here," he said. She shook her head. "No. Ilsa, my children sleep in warmth because you did not step back. I am not going to hide while they take that from you." Luan wanted to object, but understood that it was pointless. She had already decided. Weir took the hammer. "Let's go." Luan looked at his system, then at the people beside him, and for the first time all this time felt that this was no longer just a project. This was a front line, and outside the windows in the snow and darkness, people really were standing. There were more of them than he had expected, and among them in a heavy fur cloak, Oren stood calmly. He was not even looking toward the workshop. He was looking at the street, at the neighboring houses, at the lighting windows, at the people who had begun to come outside, and at faces that were no longer frightened. It was then that Luan understood. Tonight was not about a pipe. It was about the right to decide who in this city would live warm, and now it had become clear to everyone that the battle was only beginning.